My name is Wantodi. I am Ngāti Porou First Nation, which is from the east coast of New Zealand. We are about 60, last census, 66,000 strong, I think. We're the second largest First Nation in New Zealand. And I was brought up in I was born on the east coast, but I was brought up in a town called Wainuamata, which is not far from the capital in Wellington. I am a criminologist. I tend to put that down because that's what I'm I'm employed as a lecturer. But and as I'll explain in more detail later, I'm sort of turning away from that tag, even though I still use it, because when people say, "What do you do?" You've got to say, I've got to give them something that they can hold on to. I'm probably more a social activist. I am an academic. I'm certainly not from the objective school, if you like, of research and writing. I'm very subjective. My role in the academy, as far as I see it, is to speak on behalf of my people in particular, and in relation to the issues that face First Nations generally, in relation to the way in which the state responds to us in relation to criminal offending and our issues politically. So I sort of say criminologist, but I've started to write critically lately about my own discipline, and I'm not particularly happy with criminology when I've started to think critically about the role that criminology has played in the subjugation of First Nations. Initially, when it started, it developed as one of those human sciences that played a significant role in colonisation, along with psychology and social work and others, and no disrespect to any people who work in those areas. And then I look at the way in which criminology, particularly administrative criminology, which focuses, in my view, on the needs and wants of the state, tends to be part of that process of the criminalising of First Nations and of Māori, because they tend to view us from the view of the state's focus on reducing crime, etc. So, yeah, I just thought I'd throw that out there for you. What I'm going to talk about today, there's three things I wanted to talk about. First, I think, what was the title, Larry, of the discussion? Something to do with Māori, Indigenous youth gangs and Māori policy. So what I thought I'd do is I would talk a little bit, if I can, about New Zealand, okay, and Māori policy making in New Zealand. And there is a method to my madness, because then I want to stream down to the specific issue of why it is that in that particular jurisdiction, why I believe in a lot of other jurisdictions, whether it's Canada and America, we've actually failed to develop effective policy re-Indigenous issues, and also particularly with the youth gangs and youth justice, which is the area that I finished my government work. By the way, I'm going to be quite critical of government, but I did work in the policy industry for 10 years in New Zealand before I went back to teaching. And the focus of my work was mainly the criminal justice system in relation to make the development of Māori policy or policy in relation to Māori issues, and restorative justice and youth gangs. There's some similarities. If you look at the Canadian context in policy making, I see a lot of similarities to New Zealand. You can basically distinguish about 3 or 4 different phases of policy making in relation to First Nations and criminal justice matters. And it really relates to, I guess, what are the underpinning ideology under policy making in relation to those peoples. So in New Zealand for a long time, until about, say, from 1860, when we had the formation of an actual formal state in New Zealand, to around about 1960, assimilation was, if you like, the basic ideology that drove policy making in government. It doesn't matter what different area you're talking about, whether it be education, health, criminal justice, all right? The drive was to assimilate us, to turn us into brown Europeans, basically. Our culture, our language and our practices were all denigrated. We were seen as lesser people, and that the only way for us to survive, to be meaningful members of New Zealand society, was for us to become white. And in the 1960s, there was a movement towards integration as the key ideology underpinning Māori policy. Okay. That was really, if you like, a slightly more benign form of assimilation. And what it really meant in practice was that they didn't write about us in such stark terms as the criminal other and that. So really, when you look at the policy, it was basically a change in terminology, but not in intent. Okay, so it was just simply using another word for the same. That all changed in New Zealand in the 70s and 80s because we got a bit stroppy. We started to radicalise in a major way. At about the same time, of course, that we had the rise of the second wave of the feminist movement. We had the rise of AIM and Red Power in North America, Black Power, etc., etc. And we had the same process happen in New Zealand. That was driven by Māori who were members of the union, the growing Māori feminist movement. Some of us started to actually sneak into universities through the back door. And so we developed an intellectual group as well. Okay. And so what we had was a major shift away from the way our people had engaged with the state in New Zealand for over 100 years. And how we'd engaged with the state was, it wasn't that our people and our elders in the past were not concerned with, for example, the government's policy in relation to our land, or the education and social welfare policies that were decimating our family practices, for example, our care and protection processes we had in place. It's just that they were, say it too polite probably. Right? We had a lot of debate in our communities and a lot of very forceful rhetoric. But Jim, we, for whatever reason, for a number of reasons, decided to take a very, a polite approach. So, for example, we were sold on the government, say, telling us, if you've got an issue with your land, whatever, then you go through the formal courts. Of course, the formal courts in those days didn't actually recognise our treaty as having any basis in law. Okay, so, or we would be persuaded to bring delegations to Parliament. Okay, in the 70s that completely changed, and what we did was we had this radicalisation of Māori politics, where we were basically, they were forcefully criticising the government's performance in a range of policy areas, from land-based policy to education, health, social welfare, and in particular criminal justice. Now what this resulted in the, when we get into the 80s and 90s, was what some people have called the biculturalization of policymaking in New Zealand. So the government started to say things like, well, okay, there are some issues here in relation to how we've developed policy and its impact on Māori. And so there was this, they started talking about how we actually partner with Māori to make better policy. And so they called it, I call it the bicultural turn. In reality, what it really meant was symbolic gestures. So for example, departments would suddenly give themselves a Marty name. So the Ministry of the Internal Inland Revenue, for example, called itself Te Tare Tāke, and Tāke is T-A-A-K-E, which we thought was really funny because it translates to the Ministry of Take. And so we thought that was quite amusing. They thought it meant something else. I think one of our elders, was having them on a little bit, But they still have it, it's all on their letterheads and everything. Prison, this is not irony. One I really love, and they still do it. Given that we're 14.5% of the population in New Zealand and 50% of the prison population, all new prisons they open, they give them Māori names. Now, I've had arguments even with my elders about this, even though I've been told really not meant to argue with my elders. I don't argue with them, I have a debate, respectful debate. And they said, well, in some ways it's honouring. I don't see how it's honouring us, but they're almost like that name. I said, well, okay, at least it's got something Māori about it, because the prisons ain't, when you go in there, there's really not much else that you can recognise as Indigenous, but at least they've got a name. Anyway, but that's sort of what I call, that's the symbolic reality of biculturalisation of policy. Things like, and I'm sure you've had this here, they'll get elders in to run cultural courses in language, where you would learn to say hello, do a mihi, which is introduce yourself, have a noho marae, which is a marae stover. A marae is like our longhouse. They're really funny. I love going to them because you get all these sort of European middle-class bureaucrats who all of a sudden realise that they're probably going to have to sleep on a mattress next to their boss. You know, 80 people in a room together, we're used to it, and that's fine, you know. Kids running around and everything, and it's really great because you just see a whole bunch of people outside their comfort zone. You know, 25 men and women sharing the same bathroom. Absolutely, you know, and then you think, well, we'll see how flexible you are and forgiving and accommodating. Right, but that was really, to be honest with you, the actual nature of bicultural policy. There wasn't any, consultation was the byword, okay, but what actually happened was when policy was made, consultation meant coming and showing us the policy after it had been developed and asking us, isn't this, what do you think about this? Isn't this a great idea? Right. That's my long-winded introduction to where we got in the late 80s. Where we got to in the late 80s was, I think, not by accident, influenced by Māori criticism of the criminal justice system through two mechanisms. Moana Jackson, Māori lawyer and researcher, spent 3 years in the mid-80s going around New Zealand, and he engaged with about 3,500 Māori justice practitioners, ex-prisoners, current prisoners, jurists, what have you, okay, to actually get an idea of what our main concerns with the criminal justice system were. And he developed he put it out as a book called He Whaipanga Hau, Māori in the Criminal Justice System in 1988. It contained 42 major recommendations, broken into 4 different areas. One was policy making in general. The second was correctional or penal policy. And so he had a whole bunch of recommendations about how we actually deal with the ineffective nature of program delivery and services in prisons. And of course, the key one was, don't put us in there, right? Second was, develop Māori therapeutic institutions in community, what we called habilitation centres, okay, et cetera, et cetera. The whole raft of recommendations around policing, and a whole raft of recommendations around particularly children and youth, which also involved some concerns in trying to enhance or better care and protection practices within social welfare, right? One of those areas, which was anyway, but the only one that the government ever focused on was the very last one, which was, and this is my summary of it. You know, to be honest, the European system sucks. It's punitive. It's too punishment oriented. It's racist. It's classist. You know, all these things, right? And given that it is completely a cultural anathema to us, then, you know, to be honest with you, you can make all these recommendations, these changes, and we're still not probably going to have a very effective or very pro-social system. So how about maybe you consider giving us a parallel or separate system? Well, that was the only recommendation that the media read or heard and reported. And what happened to his report was the Minister of Justice was completely up in arms and referred to Moana and his report as racist and separatist, that's right, as akin to apartheid, and he wasn't having any of it. So none of the other 42 recommendations, apart from maybe 1 or 2, were really considered in any serious way. They basically just ignored the report. Except for the youth justice area, where there was concerns about the way in which the fact that there were no diversionary processes in place. Okay, police had 2 options generally in New Zealand at that time. You arrested us, you go to youth court, okay, or you gave us a kick up the backside, sent us home, you know, informal warning system. Police didn't really like that. They thought, for example, that that meant that, you know, you get the not serious youth offenders, but ones that you could see, you know, in their view could be trouble in the future. There was something else they needed to be able to do with them, right? Now, at the same time Moana put his report out, there was a committee had been put together to critically review care and protection and social welfare practices, including youth justice. And they put their report out, in which they took Māori, the model of Māori for dealing with social harm that Moana had in his, and said, how about we develop something like this for the youth justice. Divert our young offenders away from the youth court, and of course this is the now famous family group conferencing product, I call it, intervention or program. It is the only original idea New Zealand's ever had in criminal justice. We generally just import everything. Okay. I make that point not glibly because it has become, in New Zealand context, a sacred cow. I have been not a critic of FGCs, and although practitioners come here and say that I don't like it and I say it doesn't work and stuff like that, and I may have thoughts around that, but that's not my issue with it. My issue is the way in which it's sold as an indigenous process. Slightly contradictory, but what I mean by that is what happened was that the state, actually they thought we do need to have an intermediary step, if you like, to deal with youth offenders. And so they developed the family group conferencing process, which was instituted in 1989 via legislation. And it was influenced by some of the criticisms that Marty made. But let me dispel a few myths about it. It is not a Marty process at all. It was not developed by us. We had some influence in it. It was developed by Department of Social Welfare and then Department of Justice, New Zealand public servants. And a lot of the features that they actually built around were ones that they based on international literature, not talking us and not ours. Okay? Is it a better process than we had previously? Yes. Okay. Except the way in which it's used, which is the fact that what we know now is a lot of our young people that are being referred to FGCs and previously would have been the ones, like me, when I was a young lad and I was a bit mischief, that would have been informally warned. What we're getting now is a big group of our, particularly Māori kids and Pacifica kids, who would have initially been given an informal warning, are now actually being pulled into the formal system through FGCs. There's our second myth. FGCs are not separate from the formal justice system in New Zealand. And I hear this when I come overseas. People go, oh yeah, it's diversion in its way. It's diversion in. It's not diversion away from the system. Professionals run it. The Ministry of Social Development and particularly Childcare and Protection Services are the ones that run that system. The primary players are police, youth, the youth justice coordinators and advocates, etc. Okay, so let me just dispel, it is not an informal process, it is a formal part of the system. It has some restorative features to it, okay, but that was more unintentional than intentional. If you read the cabinet papers, which I think some of the researchers, particularly in New Zealand, should do when they write about it, if you read the policy papers and the cabinet papers developed in 88 and 89, it makes it very clear what the core principles are and what the aims are. And the restorative features come at the bottom. What we had done was taken on board at the time what was happening across a number of Western jurisdictions, the movement away from sort of a welfare approach within youth justice context. In other words, dealing with some of their social problems, the drivers of criminality or social harm, okay, to one where we wanted to hold them accountable. And this, what I think David Garland, the English criminologist, calls responsibilization, holding them responsible to that community and particularly to the state, okay, of ensuring that they know, they understand the consequences and they suffer the consequences, okay. Those in terms of the top 12, if you like, outcomes or whatever, they are the most important ones. A whole industry has been built in New Zealand and internationally now, which sells the family group conferencing as an indigenous process, which it is not, as a restorative process. I think in some of their early work, Maxwell and Morris, who did initial research in New Zealand on this, actually talked about it as a restorative process. I pointed out that actually it wasn't, or it wasn't its intention, and so now they sort of say, well, it wasn't really intended to be one, but it sort of developed that way, and all of a sudden we looked at it and went, and then of course, the sea parted and we saw all the restorative elements came to the fore, all right? I've sat in on about 50 plus restorative justice conferences, family good conferences in New Zealand. Some of them are incredibly restorative. Some of them are amazing in terms of when you see quite serious offences young people have committed. I mean, for example, against elderly people. I went to one where this young Marty boy had beaten and robbed a woman. She was about 85, very frail. And I went to this and where clearly him and his family were shamed and the amazing forgiveness and the sincerity of his shame and wanting to make restitution, and ended up basically doing a whole bunch of stuff for this lady and her friends and everything like that, and the professionals that ran that process did so, I think, in a very restorative, or I actually prefer transformative way, right? But I've been to a whole bunch of others where the families wanted to come together and the victim and the offender and their communities are concerned. Okay, where either the professionals have taken a very punitive approach, where there has been reconciliation and a conferencing plan, all those bureaucratic terms, 5-point plan, what he must do, and the officials have said no. Okay, there's not enough responsibilisation. They don't use that word, I do. There must be more punishment. There must be more seen to be done that the state agrees with. Okay, I've seen. As an example of where we can fail, I've seen a court-directed restorative process where a Samoan man, about 33, drunk driving, killed a young Tongan man in Auckland. The Tongan man, only 24, 2 children, very small children, killed him. Went to court. He was found guilty of I think vehicular manslaughter. That sort of thing. And anyway, when the sentencing came, the Tongan family got up and said, we want to have a meeting. They don't call it restorative justice, They wanted to have a hui, a meeting or whatever, where we want to discuss what's happened and we want to understand why this man did this to our family, and we want to and run it in our way. So this is what happened. Tongan family and the Samoan family got together. I think it was a local church. The Tongan and Samoan communities are very church-oriented in this area, and they ran this restorative process their way. They forgave the man. He agreed to pay, not pay restitution, but to undertake restitution of some kind and everything. They went to the court. The Tongan family went to the court at the sentencing and said, we do not want this man going to prison. He has 2 children. He's the primary breadwinner. His shame is enough. And he has agreed, we've accepted that, we've forgiven him, blah, 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 all this sort of thing. And sending him to prison will only make him worse, because we've seen what happens to our community, our members of our community that go. And the judge, the judge had agreed to the restorative process as he is empowered to under our Sentencing Act 2002. So here I'm dispelling another myth. The New Zealand jurists and policymakers like to come to Canada and other countries and say, we were one of the first countries to institutionalise RJ's principles through our sentencing. Yes, they did. There's a bit there that says a judge is empowered if there's a request for a restorative conference, or to actually demand one if he wants, right? Yeah. But you missed that little clause down underneath which says, but when they come back with their plan, you pretty much got to ignore it, because you've got to stick to the sentencing framework, the tariff system, right? They don't publicise that bit. So what happened here was a judge, who was a very progressive judge in my view, was incredibly upset because I was in court watching the sentencing, who basically had to ignore the wishes of this community and sentenced this person to 2 years in prison. Okay, so I'm telling you this story because one of the reasons I like to come to Canada is I think that you're far more progressive in relation to, some of you might smile, oh, you really? Just comparatively, I ain't saying you got it right, in terms of what you're actually able to do, the space that you have maybe for yourselves in terms of government policy, okay, and particularly in Indigenous programs, which is the most stunning thing I normally say, because people always come up to me and say, you guys do so much, you're so far ahead of us. You invented family group conferencing. And I'm like, yeah? What's that got to do with restorative justice? You put it into your sentencing your legislation in 2002. I'm like, yeah, but I know because you see, I was sitting around the policy table on behalf of the Ministry of Māori Development, arguing with the Ministry of Justice and police and what have you about the meaningless nature of the wording that they were putting into that legislation. Because the rest of that legislation was where we went, for some, I don't know, I do know, was where Labour, the then Labour government, repoliticised, okay, our approach. They turned us away from the restorative path that we were sort of tentatively going down over the previous 10 to 11 years with the Institute of FGC, where the fact that they were actually looking at adult restorative processes, looking at supporting in a meaningful way through resourcing Māori initiatives, right? And Labour got back in and decided, no, tough on crime is the way to go. And so they trumpet the restorative elements of that legislation and ignore the fact that almost a whole range of violent and even some non-violent offences, they simply doubled the prison sentences and what have you. So the reason I'm telling you that is when you get policy people from New Zealand and others come over and they make these claims and comments, just ask them these questions, you know. It's yes, you did institute RJ and that, but didn't you also do all these things? Didn't you also plan to build for 4 new prisons and actually take a lot of that land for those prisons from Māori communities, for example? Or in one case, because I was there watching it, completely lied to a Māori community about the benefits that they would receive from selling their land to build a prison. Okay, none of which those benefits ever actually came to fruition at all. Like, for example, this is the Ngāwhā prison, which is in Northland, okay, which they built. And actually, the contractors promised the local iwi, the local Māori, that they would be first in line for service delivery at the same time that the Department of Corrections operational unit oversees, operational service delivery, was actually writing policy papers centralising all service delivery within corrections, and we're actually planning to cut all funding or most of the funding from iwi and mainstream service providers. Right. I almost got sacked because I rang up someone from the Elders Council in Northland and told them, and then they told corrections. I almost got sacked from my job. Where was I going? So we did have this movement towards RJ. So where are we now? So what we had was in the late 90s was we started to build a restorative justice sort of policy framework within the then crime prevention unit, which in those days used to sit, because it was seen, and this was before the punitive turn, the previous government had seen crime prevention and restorative justice as legitimate policy levers to try and reduce offending and imprisonment. And they signalled how serious they were politically by placing crime prevention unit within the Department for Prime Minister and Cabinet. In other words, the department that serves the Prime Minister. Like in the old days, your RJ stuff was housed in your Attorney General's office. Is that right? And then suddenly went into the Solicitor General's office. Now, we know what that means. That's a dumbing down, isn't it? Yeah, well, what happened was a few years ago, when the punitive turn happened, all of a sudden, the Crime Prevention Unit in New Zealand and the RJ work program slipped from the Department for Prime Minister and Cabinet back to the Ministry of Justice. The Crime Prevention Unit's now gone completely, and it's just a team within the criminal policy group. Okay? In the early 2000s, the then Minister of Justice said to his ministry, I want you to develop an actual policy framework for the development and service delivery in relation to restorative justice in New Zealand. Okay, and at the same time, we had the development of Restorative Justice Aotearoa, which was which is sort of a group that, if you like, that speaks on behalf of most of the major restorative justice practitioners. There's about 54 members or something. And they, against advice from people like me and others, decided that they were going to put all their eggs in the Ministry of Justice basket. And what some of us critics said was, that's a very, while we understand you have to, you need to work with the system or you know, within it in some ways, you must keep some autonomy and distance in relation to, because, you know, if we ever have another punitive turn, the restorative, communitarian justice approaches are going to be the first ones that are going to get hit for funding cuts, and the policy programs are going to get reduced. And that's exactly what's happened. Okay. Restorative justice, the policy group was given quite a major task and undertook it with some zeal initially. It did what policy industry normally does. First of all, it decided it needed to define what restorative justice was. Didn't come and ask any of the practitioners. They had a whole bunch of policy people sitting around and looking up on Google and reading Wekamp and Zier and I love all these, I love them to death, you know, and John Braithwaite and everything, and some other obscure Canadian people like Liz Elliott, and, you know, no. Anyway, you know, so, you know, about what is restorative justice, you know, so what I call the textbook approach in policy making. You get Bazmore's textbook on what is restorative justice, and you go to page 1, restorative justice is, and you write it down. A, this, B, that, you know. Secondly, because it's a government agency and it's looking at funding, it has to have some surety around. So the first concern of any government, it doesn't matter what policy area, is risk assessment and ensuring fiscal responsibility in its spend, right? So what it wants to do is it wants to lessen risk. How does it do that? We have to standardise. We have to have a standard program, something that we can hold up and go, this is a restorative justice program. This is how it works, what it looks like, who it deals with, what crimes it can deal with, and what can be the consequences or the results from this particular event. Why does it need that? Because it needs comparability. It needs to compare. It needs a standard approach so that when you throw these, when you resource all these different approaches, all these different programs, okay, you need to be ensured that you're going to get the same standard of service delivery. Okay. In other words, it makes the policy industry makes the mistake of conflating standards with standardisation. See, to me, standards means, if you like, is just simply a paper, a written reflection of our ethics, okay, of our actual practice, ensuring ethical practice and conduct, okay, you know, with all those core sort of values that underpin it, like respect and et cetera, right? They conflate that with standardisation, which is simply restricting practice through one model so that we can compare them, okay, we can make sure, so we know that every month we're going to get our report, okay, that tells us how many people have been dealt with, that no one is actually accepting cases outside of the jurisdiction that's set down for their particular approach, you know. You can only deal with these types of offenders, okay, because we don't want you dealing with hardened offenders or serious crimes, because, you know, if they go and re-offend, then it's going to get on the front page of the newspaper, blah, 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 and then the minister will be embarrassed and will close down your program, which happens quite a bit, okay. And so what we're talking about is the professionalisation of restorative justice, okay, which is driven by the state. Now, one of the questions I wanted to perhaps discuss when we have the open forum later was that as I've looked at this process and I've seen restorative justice in New Zealand and in other jurisdictions, including here and in America and Australia, basically rush to this marriage, into the marriage bed with the policy industry. And it's a very uneven marriage. You know, it's a very one-sided power dynamic. Okay, and I've heard of the reasons why some RJ people in the industry have actually said this is why we're doing this. You know, we have to work in the system, yes. You know, we need the resources as well. Okay, we do need to professionalise and we do need to ensure standards are adhered to, and so partnering with the policy agencies will actually enable us to do this. Okay, here's my issue, Okay, in the rush to professionalise, what we have done is move from standards to focus on standards which are community-based to standardisation, which has in fact restricted the effectiveness of restorative justice practice. We're to the point where we are delivering what the state wants rather than what communities want. And so my thinking is that we have, and quite often, lost our relevance to the community. Okay, that we've lost our it's impacted our effectiveness to actually deliver services that reduce social harm, that reflect their actual values. So that's a provocative statement. And the question related to that is, well, how can we actually regain the position of restorative justice overall within communities, whether it be First Nation or European or whatever. Okay. I was going to talk about youth gangs, wasn't I? So how did this do with youth gangs? Right. So going back to the New Zealand context, and I think this policy context, and I think this is true also for Canada at the provincial and particularly the federal level. Okay. Why is it that the policy industry behaves this way? Why does it want to standardise? Why does it want to direct? Well, one is of course of power. They have. We're not talking about one of the myths that is built around policy industry in New Zealand and others is the myth that they are apolitical. Okay, it's just rubbish. The policy industry and whatever Western democracy reflects the political dynamics within that country. Okay, so for example, when the minister decided on the punitive turn, Ministry of Social Development and Justice in New Zealand ran away from RJ and other sort of more liberal, so-called liberal approaches to dealing with social harm, like it was, I don't know, all of a sudden called a disease, It's like, and policy papers turned away from, discussions about community-centred rehabilitation centres to developing more better effective marketing so that corrections could go and sell the idea of the benefits of prisons within communities, things like that. In New Zealand, every time, a minister, I don't know, there's some significant crime that occurs, and all of a sudden, the ministers are on there saying we're going to have to look at, doubling the prison for the sentence for this type of offence, and the policy industry gets into gear. Okay, the policy industry is what I'm saying is a very political animal. It's not a neutral or an apolitical animal whatsoever. And the area in which that I think is demonstrated most significantly in New Zealand lately has been around youth gangs. Okay, about 2006, there was a series of murders and stabbings in South Auckland in New Zealand, okay, which is a predominantly lower socioeconomic region, very high percentage of Marty and Pacifica and new migrant groups or communities. And the newspapers said, talked to the police said, we believe that these were all youth gang related. There's 3 or 4 of them, right? So the whole moral panic dynamic came into play. Okay, it was in the front page of the news for weeks and weeks, and they go out and interview people who say we're so terrified of all these out of control youth and who are running around and what have you. See, at the time we had no policy mechanisms whatsoever for youth gangs. It was almost like this denial they even existed, and they did exist. So what did we do? And I just want to demonstrate, the political nature of policy making. The minister at the time said, I can't have this. I want some effective way of shutting down youth gang violence and the youth gangs, etc., etc. And so they went to the Ministry of Social Development, which is where I was working, and they said, right, we need to develop this policy. And a colleague of mine, Mike Roguski, said, hold on, we need to go and actually find out. Now, this is a novel idea in policy. We need to actually go out into this community and find out what's going on. Firstly, we need to actually find out if we do have a youth gang violence issue and there is significant conflict, right? And then we need to find out what's driving youth gang membership and what programs are there, all those sort of things, right? So we went into the community and we did this very extensive research and engagement with hundreds of youth gang members, and we spoke to the police and we spoke to youth workers and everything. And what we found was, one, in fact, those murders I told you about were not youth gang related at all. They weren't undertaken or perpetrated by patch youth gang members or anything. Some of the people who witnessed it or were related to some of the individuals concerned were youth gang members. And while I'm youth gang members, I don't mean the gang I had when I was 12 at school, which was me and my 5 buddies who called ourselves the Bros, you know, and rode around in our BMX bikes, you know, with our jean jackets on, trying to look cool in front of the girl, you know. That was our gang, see, that was our gang. See, today in New Zealand, under legislation, that would be a gang. If one of us gets arrested or gets spoken to by police, they will actually register us, they will actually write you down as a gang and as gang members or gang associates. Right? So one of the things we found was the number of youth gangs and the number of youth gang members was greatly exaggerated. And in fact, the police admitted to us in writing that the numbers they were estimating in this region, there were 12 or 1300 youth gang members. So we looked at the figures and we sat with the police and said, you seem to have a lot of add-ons, and they actually said, well, you know, what we do is if we see an incident occurring or something or some behaviour we're concerned about, our officers will go and speak to that group of 6 or 7 youth, and we'll recognise one of them wearing the colours or patches. In New Zealand, they wear like the Highway 6, the Hells Angels, you know, they wear patches and that. And we'll talk to them, and if they're a known gang member, we'll write down the other 4 or 5 people there, and we'll include them as associates. That means that, and that categorisation, which is now standard, means that I'm affiliated to about 4 different ethnic gangs in New Zealand, because I either drink with some of them because I went to school with them, or my cousins and uncles are in them. In fact, my cousins and uncles are in 2 of the major ethnic gangs, which is the Black Power, and so I am, because of that association, a gang member. Right, so we found that out. And the police were actually putting out what they knew were incorrect, exaggerated numbers. Now, why would they do that? Easy. One, it was in the news. This is an area where the police are really under a lot of pressure resource-wise. A minister said, I want something meaningful done. They see an opportunity to politicise or become involved in this political issue and insert pressure on central government to give them what they've been asking for, which was increased powers of search and detention for young people, which goes against our Bill of Rights and our child care and protection legislation, to give them more resources and what have you. What happened was that while my mate Mike was doing this research and I was looking over his shoulder writing it up, we found a number of things. One is, what the community told us was that the major agency-centred programs in place weren't working for them because they just really didn't match with the community's needs and values. We asked them about what solutions they wanted, and what they wanted was more social development. They wanted more transformative policy in relation to dealing with 30 or 40 years of very, very poor delivery of economic and social policy in these areas, and they wanted to be empowered to do that. They wanted a lot more resources put into their schools, which basically were at the bottom of the pile or list when it came to funding from central government, because most of the money went to the schools that were in Remuera and the white middle class areas, all those sort of things. So their understanding of what drove their young people to go into gangs and that was around identity. It was around the fact that there were a lack of opportunities, which were directly resulted to government policy, right? And the fact that most of the social developmental programs, or the programs that were in there to deal with social issues, were ones imported from Wisconsin and Canada and all these other places, right? So what did we do? Well, when Mike and I were writing up the research, we found out that our policy team, who was supposed to be dealing with us, we had already written the policy. They'd actually, in fact, been having interagency meetings with all the other agencies to say, how are we going to deal with this? Before we'd even finished the research, right? making two of our chapters in our research redundant. One was the causes and drivers for youth gang membership and violence in this area. One was we said, well, there isn't actually as much crime and violence as you're making out. The numbers are exaggerated. However, this is what the community needs, they think, to actually give their young people some choices, you know, and to be able to make more pro-social choices and what have you. Anyway, what did the policy response? It was health, because it was an interagency approach, health and education and all those were involved. What did they do? They just pumped up and wanted more money for their programs that were already in the community, like Family Start Street, which actually, in fact, were institutionally focused and with exact programs that the community told us were not actually working. You know, they wanted, for example, I'll give you one really small example. Ministry of Social Development at the time were contracting a whole bunch of youth workers to wander around this area to engage. Not one of those youth workers that contracted at the time lived or came from that region. So what do? They pumped in a few million more dollars into these programs, and so those same people who are not engaged with the community, I'm not saying that some of them didn't do good work, right? Basically got more money. But here's the catch. Remember that this whole policy work was started because of a moral panic around youth gangs. And it was actually, in fact, initially called the Youth Gang Strategy for South Auckland. Problem is, you see, when they started talking, the other agencies said, oh, you know, if we get involved in this, we might have to engage with gang members. See, there's an unwritten rule in New Zealand policy, you don't engage with gangs. The only ministry that did was mine, Ministry of Marty Development, okay, and a couple of Māori superintendents in the police who were enlightened enough to know that if we wanted to know what was going on with the gangs, you actually got to go and talk to them, you know. And I'm talking about the adult gangs, not just the youth. See, the youth gangs are conduits into, you know, for membership of the adult gangs. They were, so anyway, oh, that's right, I forgot to tell you that, but, you know, when we went in, we thought there was a little, what would happen is that we'd found that there wasn't an escalation in violence amongst the youth gangs. But when the police and the minister wanted to get on the front page, you know, I look tough on crime and we're concerned about youth gangs, then we started to have the youth gangs wandering around looking for each other going, oh yeah, this is really cool, we're getting publicity. This is amazing. So we did start to have some tension. And the police solution was, right, that's it, we're going to clamp down. Curfews, anyone that looks like a gang member, I'm not sure if you're not wearing a patch what that means, you know, scruffy, you know, there's tendency for teenage boys now to have their jeans hanging down, half down their backsides and stuff, you know, whatever. And they're picking up, you know, harassing kids and everything and arresting them and stuff, causing even more tension. And it caused more tension. So we thought, well, what we did was because a lot of these youth gangs associate with adult gangs like the Black Power and the Mongrel Mob. My boss at the time, Harry Tam, was an ex-leader of the Mongrel Mob and he worked in policy, right? So he rang around the leaders of the adult gangs and said, could you go and talk to your young fellas and get them to settle down? So we funded it. And we went along and we went in there with these adult gang members to sit down with these young guys and say, stop it. Because, you know, have you got a problem? No, we're just seeing in the paper, well, you know. And so we used that mechanism to settle the tension down. But we didn't get any credit for it. Oh, no. See, the central state process, the one that all the other agencies had just been announced. And then with about a month, you know, they hadn't even put any of their mechanisms in place. The police district commander and the minister or whatever is up there saying, see, the tension's reduced already and we've only just begun. But it actually was reduced by us actually engaging with other adult gang members. Okay, so we used those in-community contexts to actually try and deal with some of those problematic behaviours that were drawing attention to these young people. And then we decided, which is a completely novel approach in terms of youth gang or gang policy in New Zealand, and then we decided we'll take that opportunity now that we've got their attention. We sent our, we actually even employed some of these ex-gang members and current ones, policy people, and we went in and sat down with the youth gangs and said, what do you want? What do you need? You know, what are some of your issues, and what do you want in the future, and you know, why are you a member of a gang? You know what we found out? One of the reasons, there were two main reasons why they were members of gangs. One is because, well, because I'm related to everyone, and that's just how we formulate. Two, we do have some issues around here with the way in which the police harass us. and the way in which, we got some adult offenders doing certain things, so we band together for protection. So out the window goes, the administrative criminological view and that of the policy industry, that the primary driver is offending and criminality, right? I mean, it is associated with some of the problematic outcomes from that type of group membership, but they weren't the significant drivers or motivations. Okay, it was safety, it was identity, and it was relationships. Okay, so we used some of those relationships anyway, and we found so we looked at the statistics and we found that one of the primary ways in which these young people were being driven into the formal criminal justice system is they all were driving without licenses. So we went and contracted social service delivery, service delivery within these communities to take them in groups so we could get them licensed. Now, it seemed to me, I don't know if it's social development, but it's a particularly, rational response to it. If that's what, so we went in, and they said, we can't afford it. We can't afford to, mum and dad don't own a car, so my dad can't teach me. So they go and steal a car and they drive. They learn to drive. I can't afford the lessons, I can't afford this, so we subsidised it. We got criticised by the Ministry of Justice, who said, why are you wasting money like that? And I said, because if this is a key driver for them, it's a very simple solution. You know what they said? They said, wouldn't it be better to just talk to them about how they should behave legally and uphold the law? And I said, where they live, they don't give a stuff about law, and they don't sit down and read legislation, It's just, so in other words, a really institutional sort of, policy make. I call it the window gazing approach. Policy making. When I first went into policy in New Zealand, I went from the academy, teaching university, into policy. And I used to make some very critical comments, as you can imagine, in some meetings. And someone would always say, that's so like an academic, ivory tower. And I remember sitting in this meeting with the Ministry of Justice and police. Police are a bit different because most of them have had street experience. And I said to the Ministry of Justice people, how many of you are working on youth gangs or youth-related offending policy? And because I knew most of them were, because that's what we're talking about. And I said, how many of you have ever left your office and gone down to a youth detention unit, gone down and sat down with the youth gang, or just gone down Manners Mall where a lot of the unemployed young Marty boys sit around and talk to each other? Not one of them. And I said, yet you are the ones who are sitting in your offices and writing legislation around youth offending, writing policies about identifying the most effective ways to deal with youth gang violence, and not one of you have got the first clue about what these communities are at. Window gazing policy making. I said, what you do is you want to talk about ivory tower, you guys sit in your office, you stare at the window and you see a bunch of Maoris and you go, yep, okay, yeah, that'll do. And then you write your policy up. And that's what we did in terms of the youth gang situation at the time. What happened with our program? Nothing. We tried to actually move from dealing with things like practical things like the license, to getting agencies in to give more funding to support them into education and trade training. In other words, and targeting these groups, using the ex-gang members and adults and that, who they have respect for. Now, the agencies rejected this. They said, absolutely not. We cannot be seen to be even employing ex-gang leaders in our work. And our view was, and we said, well, but the thing is that if you want to you can't, the stupidest thing I've heard in my 10 years in working in policy was I was sitting in a meeting with the then head of the crime prevention unit. And he was English, not that I have anything against English, but he was English. He'd only been there recently. And we were having this debate. He said, you need to engage effectively with these groups to make effective policy, which means you're going to have to talk to people that don't look like you, a different colour, they've got tattoos, they look scary, but they're all nice and cuddly, really, and what have you, and you've got to engage with them, right? And this pompous idiot sat there and he says, and we said, and he was just an idiot. And he said, and I got a bit angry and passionate about it, you know, I mean, you know, Liz will know what I mean. And I was getting really frustrated. And I said, you know, the problem with you is you do not know how to engage with the other. You other us. You create us as the criminal other. You know, those bad niggers down, you know, around here who are problematic and cost the state so much money. But you don't actually know how to engage with us. And you know what this guy, he said, we know exactly how to engage with Maoris and youth offenders and youth gang members. We simply choose not to. You know, and that was just like, I'm like, wow, an honest policy maker, that's you know, but he saw no irony in it. And I was stunned, but when I walked out, I suddenly, because I was a bureaucrat too, I thought of, well, how could you be so arrogant? And then I suddenly realised it wasn't arrogance. He was simply being honest about the political nature of what he did. We choose not to because if the minister found out that we'd gone and met with gang members, or that we contracted, as my ministry did, current gang members and ex-gang members, we contracted them. We have a major problem in our Māori ethnic gang families, and that is communicable diseases. All right, because the guys go into prison and come out with all sorts of weird and wonderful diseases, and they spread it to their children and that. And so we got a phone call from a manager in health who I will not name because you'll probably get sacked if they found out, and said, look, you know, we've got a major problem because these families, their kids catch these diseases and that, you know, TB, tuberculosis and that stuff, right? Then they're going to go to school and spread it. But we've seen our you know, community whatever to go and deliver this, and we can't because, you know, they just don't want to know because, you know, they see government officials turn up. They're normally getting arrested or something, you know, so they do. So we went into some of the gangs and identified some guys who were doing some social developmental work with them from in the gang, and we contracted them to go into sit down with their own gang communities in a hall, and, you know, and they'd take the Ministry of Health people in there, and they'd have all the slideshows and say, this is why it's important, immunisation, do it now. All right? Ministry of Social Development, criminal justice sector, forget it. You know, we say, why don't you take a more socially supportive approach rather than the punitive surveillance and suppression strategies that have been the foundation of policing of gangs and of policy in relation to the gang issue in New Zealand. And so our little social development, we thought that this would be the start where we could just open that crack in the door, and it just slammed shut because, unfortunately, some of them are not particularly nice people. And around the time that we were doing this work, one of the gangs, the Mongrel Mob, did a drive-by shooting against the Black Power and killed a 3-year-old girl sitting in her with her mother in the house. So, you know, and so all the work that we did. So I have to acknowledge the reality is that some of these guys I don't think I could use the word that I used at the time. They don't help themselves, and so it's an ongoing debate between myself and others in the gang leadership who actually come to us and say, we've got a what do you call it, not pea here, you call it crystal meth. They've got a huge problem, it's killing them in droves. And they've come to us about how can we bring in an anti-drug program, how can we do this and that. And they get really frustrated and say, you know, the agency just slammed the door. And I said, well, your guys do gang rapes, and you go around doing drive-by shootings, and you shoot 3-year-old girls. Oh, we didn't mean to. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, you know. So I said, trying to get them to come to that party. So, you know, I've been very critical of the policy making in relation to it, but have to acknowledge that some of their behaviours are very, very violent, antisocial, and they don't, you know, they're their own worst enemies. We've got some of the young hotheads who want to flex their muscle and get themselves up the food chain in the gang, and we've got a policy industry that doesn't know, that is predominantly European middle class, don't live near or have any engagement with all these different problematic communities that they make policy for. And so that's very pessimistic, isn't it? I think that we can actually, so one of the questions I wanted to ask you to consider was, how do we actually change the policy environment? I mean, how do we make it get them to see that they'll do their job more effectively as public servants, because this is the thing, they're actually public servants. Although I used to anger them in New Zealand and sit there and say, no, you're political servants, not public. Because public servant to me serve the public, but if you don't engage with them, how can you? But how can we get them to change that whole dynamic, that insular nature of policy making? And I get a sense it's very, very similar here in some ways. This whole idea of political neutrality, which is at the core of, for example, the Public Service Code of Conduct in New Zealand, which I imagine is probably very similar to other public service code of conducts around in the Western jurisdictions. That's one of the fundamental principles and values that underpins the work that they do. Wedded to another core principle or practice, which of course is that they give, that they shouldn't be scared to give contrary advice, which is now wedded, of course, in the modern, there's the managerialisation of policy, the evidence-based policy context that they argue that they are in. Because that's what we've had over the last, in some ways it's contradictory. On one hand, we have had the development of the politics of politics, as you say. Before I came over, there was there's a really great program on Australia, in TV on Australia, where I now teach. And it was actually all these different film seminars for a conference called the Conference of Dangerous Ideas, and they brought all sorts of people there. Yeah, it's fantastic. Anyway, they had a panel which included a couple of academics and a couple of media people. And there was, and I can't remember his name. There's a guy there. I think he was a political science lecturer. I think at the University of Western Sydney, and he was in India. Well, that's got much to do with it, but Indian guy. And I'd never seen him before. And he described to me politics now in Western democracies, and probably the best way I've ever, because I keep thinking, why is it that they're so aggressive? And it's more about point scoring and winning. And he turned around and said, I'm a political scientist here, but today, he said, if I want to read in the media or listen to meaningful debates and discussions about meaningful things like social values, connecting with people, he said, overcoming conflict, person management, I read the sports pages. If I want to read about sport, I turn to the front page and read about the politics. Because politics is now sport. He said, we're not, is this policy a good idea? Is this policy going to actually achieve what it says it is? Or can we improve it? It's how has the government effectively presented the policy? Do we give them points on the scoreboard for it? Oh, this minister said the wrong word, he described it in Parliament, so we subtract the point. He said politics is now sport, and the media, so the media is not interested, nor are the politicians, in meaningful debate. There's a number of reasons for it. One is, personally, I think it's because of the calibre of people who are in politics in New Zealand and Australia. Secondly, the calibre of the people in the media. And thirdly, they underestimate our interest in these things. In other words, they actually think we're stupid. Or actually, in fact, I look at so I've got some mates in the media in New Zealand, and I've made them very angry lately because I have a drink with them and I told them, I said, we're actually more interested than you think in general. Now, how do I know that? Because I go a lot into Māori communities, where we still, like here with the longhouse system here in Tauranga, where the elders will say, we want to have a meeting because we're concerned about there seems to be domestic violence seems to be increasing, or we've had a bit of issue about, some of our children have been wandering the street unattended and looked after. So the community come together, right? And we're going to get the Ministry of Social Development people to come along and tell us about what they've got. And you'll get our communities going there. And they're not, they are educated to me, because they're educated in our way. But to the policy industry and to the media, what they see is a bunch of dumb, uneducated Maoris who left school at 14 and 15. What they don't see are people who have successfully raised families, who are carrying out their social and cultural obligations that are inherent within our communities, and who are concerned for their children, blah, blah, blah. They just see a bunch of people who didn't go to university and get a master's or do media training and political science and all this rubbish, right? So we're not clever enough to understand policy, right? There's a couple, and you know what? The way in which policy is written, which is this obscure, you know, meaningless rubbish that I used to get in these cabinet papers, you know, that's not surprising, but it's not our problem. It's a problem of articulation. That comes with the professionalisation of policy making. So yeah, anyway, I thought I'd tell that story because I thought, yeah, that actually makes sense. You know, politics is more like sport now, and if you want, and I thought it was really cheeky. So if you want to read about those big ideas and things that we're concerned about, you know, you read about the NHL, or whatever, and so I think there's some of the, and that's I think some of the problem is the politicisation of the public service. I don't think the public service has ever been apolitical. To me, it's just a myth. I think more so now. I think in New Zealand, Cabinet has become more directive. You know, this is our policy manifesto, and you will implement it. Like, for example, what have we resurrected after the National Party got in? The policy platform for youth, boot camps. I mean, there's a truckload of research that tells us that they didn't work. You know, what did you have in England in the 70s and early 80s when you had boot camps? You had all these skinheads walking around and they'd go like that and they'd have a tattoo saying, I survived, you know, boot camp 101. Because they saw that as a marker of respect, you know, that they were tough enough to survive and actually enhance their membership of a youth gang or whatever, you know. Not something that actually diverted them away from any sort of socially harmful behaviour at all. But no, and yet, you know, the ministry, bless them, Ministry of Justice did actually put out a paper saying they're not a particularly good idea. The minister said, no, implement it. So the next papers that come out, guess what they did? This is an evidence-based policy environment. There was none of the research that I've read that shows you how problematic the approach is, right? They cited one or two obscure papers that actually agreed with the policy process and ignored the whole weight of evidence itself. Now that's a political decision. They hide behind, oh, but we were directed by our minister, and I point out to them that particular part of the Public Service Code of Conduct that says that they are, firstly, they are there to speak on behalf of the public and to ensure that policies brought in by government are not any way harmful or you know, or anything like that. And I said, you are actually, when the policies that the government wants to bring in, the weight of evidence demonstrates that it will be harmful, you are obliged to present that view to policy. They say that, yeah, but they think this, yeah, but we do that, and if they ignore it, there's nothing we can do. Well, that's a load of rubbish. I said, that's a load of rubbish. Because if you just turn around and said, we will point blank refuse to put this in place, it ain't going to be put in place because Cabinet can't do it. You know, and so I say, if you were true public servants and behaving as the Public Service Code of Conduct actually says you should do, then you would actually fact resist. I said, you're the one group probably in the whole community, society that can resist Cabinet and the politicians. So anyway, I was going to talk about, well, you know, how do we overcome these issues, and so we do it ourselves. See, we're advanced, and like some of the things I've been talking to students while I've been here is I asked them about their impressions of New Zealand for a start, right? And a lot of people here say, oh, you know, in terms of Indigenous issues, you're so in advance of Canada. You know, I say, well, oh, you've got the treaty. We've got one treaty for all of us, right? And you look at what your government gives you, and you've got treaty settlement process, which is in some ways bringing good outcomes because like my iwi got, you know, 50 or 60 million for its settlement, and we've reinvested some of it into our forestry and fisheries, and we're using the money from that to actually design and deliver our own social services, including restorative programs, drug and alcohol therapy, anger management. A lot of the big tribes that with the settlement money have opened what we call hauora, which means health, but they're like service. They're like a one-stop shop. So you can go there, like Ngāti Hini in the north, Ngāi Tahu down south, which is the biggest tribe down there. They've turned their treaty settlements into, they run their own hauora, which means you can go there for all those services, health, We fund our own schools. I don't know if you know this, we have 464 kongareo, which are language nests, part funded by us, part funded by government, which are kindergartens, where our language is the first language and culture. We run our own high schools and primary schools. I think you call them primary schools, years 1 to whatever, 12, is it? 13, and we have 3 of our own universities. And how do they come about? Because some of our people went to the government in the 70s, 80s and said, our language is dying, we want to open kohanga reo. Government said, not interested, waste of time, language is dying anyway. So we just opened them with, very small pockets of money from iwi and fundraising, and then it just expanded and expanded. And then of course the government looks at this and goes, ooh, we've got all these Māori kids aren't going to our schools. So the next minute, after not being interested, they come along and go, this is a really good thing, but we think we can help you out by ensuring you deliver good standards, and we'll give you a bit of funding, Because, I might ask, how can we, my people, because I don't advise First Nations elsewhere, that's not my job. But they say, how do we get what we want? I said, do it anyway. Do it anyway. Look what happened, we got our own, and then we thought, oh, we got away with that, so we developed high schools. Got away with that, we opened 3 of our own universities with our money. Then the government's come on afterwards and they said, we'll give you FTEs, bums on seats, we'll give you a bit of funding and stuff like that. And so one of the things that we've done in terms of training our future leaders is that looking at developing accreditation within those institutions that will train our future leaders of social service programs and RJ and everything on our standards and based on our ethics. So, yeah. Anyway, I better stop there because we need to have the break, and then the open forum. Yeah.